Shalom, it's Rabbi Josh Rose. And the other night, my wife Hannah and I watched a great Frontline documentary about the 1996 climbing disaster on Mount Everest. I know that doesn't sound like a lot of fun, but it's a fascinating topic to me. I also read a great book called Into Thin Air by John Krakauer, a journalist who was on that climb, in which several climbers lost their lives. What is it that attracts us to these stories of people enduring very extreme situations and confronting death? I think that there's something powerful in the narratives of the survivors, that sometimes we hear from survivors of such situations that the experience of confronting mortality can sometimes lead people to have clarity about their own lives, and that their lives can become enriched, ironically, even when they endure great trauma and come through it with physical scars sometimes, and that the experience of confronting their own mortality and having to really come up to the edge of their own lives can give them deeper insight into themselves and who they are, and also gives them deeper insight perhaps into their relationship with other people in the world. It's in that light that I want to view this week's Torah portion, which is called Vayeira. And this week's Torah portion contains one of the most famous stories and one of the most difficult stories in the Torah, which is the Akedah, that is the binding of Isaac, the moment at which Abraham is told to bring his son up to the mountain and to offer him. And of course, the turning point of the story, and the point of the story, the larger point of the story, is that he is finally prepared to do this, but is told not to, as the voice calls out, Avraham, Avraham, do not offer your child, he is told. And Abraham and Isaac return, and God's breathed with Abraham through Isaac that this people will have a unique relationship and a covenant of which they can bring light into the world can continue. I think very often people make the mistake of viewing this story and trying to evaluate the story as outsiders, viewing this character, this person named Avraham, and asking, did he do the right thing? Would I have responded in the same way? Why did this happen to Avraham? And of course, there's value to understanding that. But I also think that sometimes to understand the story, we have to step back and see the universal quality in the narrative. And I think that's where people often miss the full impact of the story. Because I think finally, the Akedah is really a story about a human being confronting the possibility of his own mortality. And beyond that, the mortality of the next generation, of his own child, which is to say, he's confronting the possibility that everything his life has been about, and all of his hopes for the ordering of the world, and all of his hopes for how his particular vision of the world and all of his hopefulness and all of the blessing he wants to bring into the world will continue after him. What happens when we have to confront this darkness that we sense in life sometimes, that life is not all about our dreams and our hopes, but is also sometimes about loss and difficulty, and even a sense of dread. Now, before I get too depressing here, let me just say that I think that finally this story does have an incredibly positive, powerful message, but here is the paradox. I think that we, in ordinary day-to-day life, often try to escape from suffering. We try to run from it. We run towards pleasure with food or drink or whatever else it might be in our lives, or just distracting ourselves. We try to turn away from the difficulties of our lives. We try to turn away from the larger questions of our lives. And we chase, in a kind of wild, frantic way, we chase happiness, because we've come to think that life is ultimately about just being happy. I want everybody to be happy, but I think that being fully happy and having the fullest depth experience of our lives means also confronting suffering, confronting our deepest fears, and also confronting our own mortality. Rather than run from those things, I think we have to consider how we relate to them and how they affect our lives. And only when we do that can we have the fullest measure of our lives and the fullest understanding of what our lives are to be and what our purpose is to be. And I think that that is what appeals to so many people about narratives of folks like the people on that tragic 1996 climb on Mount Everest, who had to confront in such extreme conditions their own mortality. And I think that that is a way of appreciating this Vayeira story, this famous story of the Akedah, that Avraham is being forced to confront the end of this promise and of his hopes and his dreams, and ultimately his ability to stare that in the face, so to speak, is what allows his life to have further blessing and allows him to have the deepest level of understanding in his life. And so too with us, that when we run from suffering and chase a kind of fleeting happiness, there's going to be a limit to the depth and the meaning and the insight of our lives. When we can confront a world of difficulty, pain, suffering, and our own fear, that life doesn't always take the course that we want, and that it is fleeting, necessarily fleeting. Only when we do that can our lives have the richest measure and the possibility of blessing and success for us. So those are my thoughts, and Shabbat Shalom.